Hello, everyone. I'm Ashton, DeFonte. Francesca, Hyde, and Karina will be speaking as well. Our presentation is on the academic achievement gap as it pertains to African Americans. Under the 14th Amendment itself, all children could not be denied equal access to education and schooling if it is offered near them. This goes for across the country. This was ratified in 1868, yet today we are still having difficulties giving equal education. The academic achievement gap, by definition, is statistically significant and persistent differences in academic performance or educational attainment between different groups of students. African American students seem to have to go through this experience with this gap the most. From discrimination to the unknown implicit bias, it is shown through teachers' and parents' actions and behaviors. This all becomes instilled in children. Struggles start for them as they are treated differently and unfairly. This begins to make them feel that they should be a certain way and aren't appreciated the same. At this point, it becomes a problem of our country and of our world. All research done to find these things seem to just be created in the last 10 years. Yet we are supposed to have equal education for decades now. Why does it seem like we are just now noticing this problem? And why did it take so long for us to notice it? The academic achievement gap affects people of many cultures. African Americans have been found to be the most affected. From the very beginning, teachers and parents instill beliefs into children, whether it is implicit or explicit. The effects occur instantly. This, in turn, is then carried to their children and it spreads. Then it becomes our society and our culture to express these beliefs or to hide them. For generations, these biases have been carried on, showing who is good and who is bad, who is smart and who is dumb. It is now and has been a problem to our world. Barbara Bowman brings in an article addressing the academic achievement gap. The well-being of our country is being affected. This is a major issue and needs to be addressed more seriously. People's entire lives are being changed by it.
Okay, so I'll be talking about how the academic achievement gap affects identity development. So how do we determine intelligence? Often we define smartness or intelligence as something done to others in terms of social positioning, used to determine social identity of others and ourselves in terms of academic intelligence. And that definition was from Beth Hatt, who performed a study that observed smartness as a cultural construction. So often judgments of intelligence are based on an individual's specific theories of and definitions of intelligence. And we often can get these different definitions of intelligence through our parents, our teachers, and just anyone who has some sort of influence in our lives. And often how we define intelligence can affect how we perceive our peers and our own intelligence. Okay, so the role of our education system. A lot of aspects of the education system play a role in how we shape our academic identity. So a big factor that plays a role is teacher expectations. So teachers, just like us, have their own implicit theories of how they define and identify intelligence. And often that's how they judge how smart we are in school. So in Hatt's study, I'm quoting from her article that she said a student's high performance is tied to how closely the student's parents have trained their children in a way that matches the teacher's conception of intelligence. And basically what that means is that the values that the parents instill in certain aspects of intelligence, if they don't line up with how the teachers define intelligence, then that student may not do as well in class because of what they're being evaluated on, and not necessarily be related to their overall intelligence. So current assessment methods in our school system, they often analyze only a small scope of our abilities, for example, memory and recall, or just our overall test-taking abilities. And because these assessment methods are only looking at smaller amounts of abilities, it can affect the self-perception of students who do not score as well on these tests and assessments. So how does our racial identity relate to our academic identity? So to define our academic identity, Hat defines it as the way we come to understand ourselves within and in relation to the institution of schooling, and how this identity shapes our own self-perceptions of efficacy, ability, and success in relation to academic potential, performance, and achievement. So often African American students are assigned to lower ability classes and are less likely to be included in gifted programs at school than white students. And that can happen despite having similar ability levels. So what this labeling of lower or higher ability classes does is it can negatively impact students in lower ability classes' self-concept and lead them to believe that they aren't smart. And for African American students specifically, it when they don't see as many African American students in gifted classes and often see them placed in lower ability classes, it can lead them to think that this occurs because of their inherent inability to excel in school. And they'll believe it's tied to their racial identity, when in reality, it usually can occur due to possible biases in the school system.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about how racism, discrimination, and stereotypes all interact with the academic achievement gap. So a growing body of studies have begun to dismiss the assumptions that genetics or cultural differences lead some students, such as African Americans, to do poorly on standardized academic tests and other academic performances. Instead, it's becoming clear that negative stereotypes raise doubts and anxieties in a test taker's mind, resulting in the phenomenon called the stereotype threat. Psychologists have found that even passing reminders that someone belongs to one group or another, such as a group stereotyped as inferior in academics, can wreak havoc when it comes to test performance. Two researchers, Steele and Arison, gave Black and white college students a half an hour test using difficult items from a verbal graduate record exam. In the stereotype threat condition, they told students that the test diagnosed intellectual ability, thus potentially eliciting the stereotype that African Americans are less intelligent than whites. In the non-stereotype threat condition, the researchers told students that the test was a problem-solving lab task that said nothing about ability, presumably rendering the stereotypes irrelevant. In the stereotype threat condition, African Americans who were matched with the whites in their group by SAT scores did less well than their white counterparts. In the no stereotype threat condition, in which the exact same test was described as a lab task that did not diagnose ability, African Americans' performance rose to match that of the equally skilled white students. Additionally, experiments that minimize the stereotype threat endemic to standardized tests also resulted in equal performance. One study found that when students merely recorded their race, presumably making the stereotype salient, African American students still performed worse than white students. A recent study suggests that the stress of racial discrimination may partly explain the persistent gaps in academic performance between some non-white students and their white counterparts. A team of researchers found that the physiological response to race-based stressors, be it perceived racial prejudice or the drive to outperform negative stereotypes, leads the body to pump out more stress hormones in students from marginalized groups. The biological reaction to race-based stress is compounded by the psychological response to discrimination or the coping mechanisms students use to battle this stress. What emerges is a picture of African American students whose concentration, motivation, and learning is impaired by unintended and overt racism. Prior research has established racial differences in levels of cortisol too. Cortisol is a hormone that increases when the body is stressed, and it has been shown to have a big difference between African American and white students. Two sources of stress encountered by African American students are perceived discrimination, the perception that you will be treated differently or unfairly because of your race, and stereotype threat, which I had discussed in the last slide. According to the research, among a population of students, perceived discrimination from teachers was related to lower grades, less academic motivation, and less persistence when encountering an academic challenge. The study also found that anxiety surrounding the stereotype of academic inferiority undermines students performing academic tasks. Over time, children begin to develop strategies to reduce these racial stressors, but even these can have consequences for academic success. Students might devalue the importance of doing well on tests or decide that doing one school is just not a part of their identity. Within individual classrooms, teachers may mistake a Black preschooler's hyperactivity for bad behavior. Within public school districts, recruitment and hiring practices tend to leave out African American educators or pay them less than their peers. Higher education has a long history of excluding African Americans entirely. Racism and hate crimes continue to persist on college campuses. The strongest predictors of a racial achievement gap between African American and white students are socioeconomic disparities and segregation. Opportunity hoarding occurs when one social group restricts access to a resource through outright denial or by exercising control that requires the outgroup to pay for that access. Opportunity hoarding is enabled through a socially defined process of exclusion. Examples include college admission processes that favor alumni nepotism in hiring and housing practices. Currently, students of color are disproportionately subject to corrective action in schools. Suspension, expulsion, and in-school detention causes students to miss classroom time and fall further behind in their coursework. Statistics show that Black children represent 18% of preschool enrollment, but are 48% of the students receiving suspension in preschool. From kindergarten through high school, African American students are nearly 4 times as likely to be suspended and nearly twice as likely to be expelled as white students. African American boys are about three times more likely to receive a suspension than white boys, and African American girls are 6 times more likely to receive a suspension than white girls. Implicit racial bias can help us to better understand how institutional racism and other forms of bias affect educational experience of students from marginalized communities. Several studies, including one from even just last year, showed that researchers reported that teachers who were asked to rate students' academic abilities scored African American students far below white peers with identical scores. Such implicit bias can have serious negative consequences. Teachers tasked with recommending students for gifted programs might overlook Black students who could excel in those programs.
Next, I will be speaking of the worldview of the academic achievement gap in African Americans. This all is most likely expressed across the globe as well, relating to other ethnicities elsewhere. But here it may be worse due to our history. It is obvious what is going on to other countries as well. There are many socially unjust happenings and racial discriminations occurring. Academic achievement gaps are just one of them. These gaps are experienced by others as well. Melinda D. Anderson, in an article she wrote about the stress of racism affecting learning, brought in that racial discrimination may be partly explain the persistent gaps in academic performance between some non-white students, mainly Black and Latino youth, and their white counterparts. By this, she is saying that racial discrimination is only one of the many things that begin to affect non-white students. This is found all across our country, occurring to many different people. This is found across the country more than 50 years after Brown versus Board of Education was established. On top of this, segregation brings in a great role as well. Families start to have different income levels and can only do so much to help. This then leads people of these different classes to live in specific areas, which in turn starts stereotyping and discrimination against areas and types of people. At this point, it stems out to many even larger problems that many are trying to combat every day and protest by giving their lives to help.
Okay, so how can we address this problem of academic achievement gap for African Americans? So the first step in our solution is we need to deconstruct our stereotypes and assumptions. So this is a process that does not produce results overnight. It's often gradual and slow. But in order for people to even consider readjusting their stereotypes and their assumptions, they need to encounter someone or something that contradicts the stereotype. And that is the basis for our solution to this issue.
So we believe that we can help reduce stereotypes by increasing exposure to African American role models. Schools should bring in more role models and speakers for African American students. This will then hopefully overall improve diversity on school and college campuses. In order to do this, schools must actively and enthusiastically participate in recruiting more African American teachers and staff. Research even suggests that students of color who have at least one teacher of color may do better on tests and be less likely to receive punishment. The same research also shows that white students, too, showed improvement in problem solving, critical thinking, and creativity when they had diverse teachers. Furthermore, schools should be required to provide comprehensive and constructive cultural courses and resources. Teaching diversity exposes students to various cultural and social groups, therefore better preparing these students to become citizens in their own communities. These culturally responsive teaching strategies will also help to promote a healthier academic identity development for African American students.
Right, and a few questions we wanted to leave for you guys to reflect on are what may be easier to address first? African American students' academic identities or teachers' academic professionals' implicit biases? What can schools do to help African American students handle their stress? And besides the ways that we provided on how to help address the problem of academic achievement gap, can you think of any other possibilities on how to help solve the issue?
Thank you.
Thank you.